So when you go to the cinema, they'll have, the screen is massive and it's dark in there. Everything except the screen is dark. It's filling as much of your visual field as is possible. Surrounded on all sides by speakers. Temperature is regulated so that it's a very sort of neutral temperature. Everyone's phone has to be on silent so that the only sound you hear is what's coming from the movie. And the chairs that you're sitting on are at least meant to be as comfortable enough that you forget that you're just sitting in a chair. Kind of like, you get used to your clothes sitting on your body after a while. It's called sensory adaptation. Or if you're playing video games at night, or if you've got a VR headset on and a vibrating controller, right? The idea is to completely replace your sensory inputs, your sensory stimulus with that of another world. Your complete field of perception is that of someone else, somewhere else, somewhere unreal. This kind of immersion I like to call sensory immersion. And in the context of role-playing games, it's probably something like live-action role-play, LARP. But there are other ways to have a vivid but unreal sensory experience, like reading a book. So unless you have aphantasia, this inability to conjure mental imagery, then just simply reading descriptions of something is enough that your sensory information can take a back seat to what's happening in your imagination. What's in your imagination comes to the forefront. The actual stimulus that your sense organs are receiving moves to the background. And for a moment, you're lost in an imaginary world without there necessarily being anything near you that resembles that world at all. So that moment where the imagination takes forefront over your actual sensory information, I like to call imaginative immersion. For the longest time, I had forgotten that this could even be a part of tabletop role-playing games, or I just didn't consider it part of the hobby. Because, so many games these days want to stimulate your senses in some manner with battle maps and tokens and miniatures and things. And not to sound too cynical, but that's probably because people can sell you those things. But you cannot sell a subjective experience. But then, it happened. It happened again. I remembered what it was like. I was reading a story to my son, and I got immersed in that story. And then later on that day, I did do some role playing, and again, I got immersed. I had the same feeling, and I recaptured the idea that imaginative immersion could be part of the role playing experience. This kind of immersion, though, is a delicate thing, and it requires the right conditions to maintain it. But it is possible. It's up to you whether it's something that you want, right? But that is what we're here to talk about today. Hi, my name's Matt, and welcome to the Hang on. Hi, my name's Matt, and as a registered health professional in the state of New South Wales, Australia, I cannot condone or endorse the use of illicit substances, so please check the regulations in your area and consult with a health professional first before making any decisions that might affect your health. Welcome to the Tomb of Lime. So the GANZFELD effect, or the complete field effect, is a hallucinatory, altered perception experience, basically filling your entire visual field with a blank, flat color. Now, the proposed mechanism for this is that without stimulus, your brain still attempts to interpret what its senses are telling it. And so it tries to just piece together any stimulus that it can get, which includes internal ones, relying on what's floating around in your brain, I suppose, and so you start to see things that aren't really there. This is not too dissimilar from the way that we imagine dreams work. Now, you can do this with if you cut a ping pong ball in half and tape it to your eyeballs, or I've seen masks with a bunch of cotton balls around it. Or you can, if you want to do it at home, and you can get this outside in the real world as well, like if you're in a snowstorm. And it's possible that this is the effect that has contributed to certain kinds of altitude psychosis. People have felt a presence on the mountain, and the effect is not explained by other effects of altitude, basically. Alternatively, they have sensory deprivation tanks as well, which is another way of inducing hallucinatory experiences. There's an idea that in ancient times that if philosophers or seers or whoever wanted to have a vision, that they would go into the caves somewhere and hang out for a while. And this might be part of what explains that phenomenon. Even if you were in a bright place during the day, we can still get lost daydreaming. We can get lost in these imaginative worlds, but we're kind of staring into nothingness. It's like our eyes lose focus, and it's kind of maybe a mild sense of the GANZFELD effect. Recent research has challenged our ideas about how psychedelic chemicals work, like mushrooms. Traditionally, we thought that these substances would cause a flourishing of brain activity that coincided with the vividness of the inner experience that the person is having. But yeah, the research might be showing us the opposite picture, that taking these substances actually reduces brain activities in some meaningful way. Aldous Huxley, the author, actually wrote a book about his experiences taking mescaline. And in that, it maps pretty well onto that more recent research. The way he describes it is more like, it's not that the brain's work is to accept sensory information. It's more that the brain's work, its activity that it's doing, is actually shutting out reality, the reality that we can't handle. And by switching that stuff off with chemicals, we can actually start to see what's really there. Feel free to Google analytic idealism for a more modern take on this kind of panpsychic philosophical idea. The point is, though, that there may be a correlation between the vividness of inner experience and a decrease in stimulus on the brain. So like our eyes adjust to the darkness by dilating our pupils, our brain might be becoming more sensitive to certain stimulus when we shut off the things that are stimulating it from the outside. So when I look at these two different kinds of immersion, that is sensory immersion and imaginative immersion, the best way to achieve immersion is to either completely take over someone's senses or to completely deprive them of stimulus. And the middle ground might actually be detrimental. So for immersion's sake, then, you might want to be an extremist. The fact that, external distractions hamper our ability to be immersed in something probably doesn't sound that surprising, actually. It doesn't feel like the conditions for more vivid internal experience are given much priority in role-playing games, as if we've given up on them in favor of some other kind of experience. So in the philosophy of mind, there's a thought experiment called the philosophical zombie. A P-zombie, as they're known, is someone who looks, and acts exactly like, biologically they're exactly the same as a human being, but they're not having any inner conscious experience. So their brain is still receiving stimulus, and the electrical signals are still being sent, and it's being sent out to their muscles. They can still do stuff, and they talk, and they act exactly like a human being, but they don't have the internal heads-up display that presumably you're experiencing now. The what it's like to see colors and hear sounds and taste tastes and so on. Because the P-zombie is at least conceivable, I don't think it's difficult to imagine that you could role-play a character without any imaginative experience going on, but it'd be essentially the role-play equivalent of the P-zombie. You'd be running a sort of, it'd be a character simulation where everything your character does is consistent, but there's nothing of what it is like to be that character going on. I think the P-zombie simulation and a vivid in-character, imaginative experience could both be considered immersion if the character is all that you're focused on. But the imaginative experience is kind of like having access to the conscious experience of that character. And, well, I think that's neat. Most RPGs don't seem to be well equipped for in-character imaginative experiences, because every single meta concern or out-of-character action is going to be a break from this. And yeah, I think that even includes something like rolling dice. I wouldn't have imagined that complete immersion where you forget who you are and where you are in favor of what's going on imaginatively is possible, or certainly not desirable, right? If you have achieved this somehow, then I guess I would say wake up. It's time to wake up. But I suppose just like reading a book, you might zone out and have this imaginative experience, but then you have to come back so that you can read the next paragraph, so that continue having the experience. I suppose rolling the dice might be something like that. Just because it isn't possible to have complete immersion continuously, I don't think it means that we need to give up on it completely. It just means that we need to knock down every barrier that is practicable. So without mechanics, of which dice rolling might be one of them, to make the world feel verisimilitudinous, your immersion might be hampered by the arbitrariness of the world. So there's probably a sweet spot where out-of-character concerns are tolerated because they can add to the in-character experience. So when you look at an RPG, have a look at the weight of the out-of-character concerns as a general rule to how conducive to immersion it will be. Like how many steps are there in the dice resolution mechanic, and how much spreadsheet management do you have to do on your character sheet? Are there any phases of gameplay that specifically ask you to do out-of-character stuff or to say out-of-character things in order to make the game work? I think what you'll find is that if immersion is what you're after, then games that facilitate in-character roleplay will be best for this. In fact, everything I've said so far about what makes something good role-playing maps pretty well one-to-one with what's going to be conducive to in-character immersive experiences. So RPGs aren't like other mediums, though. There are a couple of specific concerns that we should probably have a look at. So listening to a GM, or another player describe something is probably more akin to listening to an audiobook than it is to reading it textually, right? But audiobooks can be immersive, right? But audiobooks don't give you agency. So in a way, you can be thinking about it more like guided imagery or guided meditation. This is a technique that's used in psychotherapy. By getting someone to imagine being in a certain environment, you can not only evoke sensory experiences, but emotional ones too, which means you can probably form pretty powerful connections between yourself and your character if you do this. So sometimes in these kinds of exercises, the guide might, describe something, but then ask the person, the subject, what they see or who's there or whatever, and they'll be able to fill in those details. But in an RPG, we don't really need to ask these sorts of things if we're on a similar footing with the GM as far as creating that world. So I mentioned in my video about the role of the GM that I want players to be able to add to the world in their domain for the sake of adding to verisimilitude. And yeah, there's people in the community that call this co-creation. But I have seen some misconceptions about how exactly this is done and its relationship to immersion. So I want to clear that up now. So the argument was that if a player is co-creating, then they're imagining the world and then they're going, okay, what can I add to the world? And this creates a meta game concern, because you think about your character's motivations and then you add something to the world that facilitates that. And of course, if it's metagaming, then it's breaking immersion. But I think this misunderstands the intent and the execution of what you might call co-creation. So in my mind, the GM might describe a scene and we'll imagine that scene, we'll conjure a mental image. And in our mental image, it will inevitably include a bunch of stuff that the GM didn't exactly specify, that didn't mention in particular. We're not asking you to conjure this image and then look around and go, okay, what can I add to the scene? What can I create? But rather, in the natural immersed process of just imagining what the scene is like, if you see something there that the GM hasn't explicitly mentioned, then you can interact with it. This isn't adding or creating with any meta concern. But, from the outside to a player who didn't hear the GM specifically mention the thing that you're now interacting with, it kind of looks like it's a co-creation process. Doing it this way will cause less of a break of immersion because you don't have to quiz the GM on how it is that they see the world in order to be able to interact with it. So as players add in this kind of passive way, the other players can add to their mental picture of what the scene is like with the higher resolution that you provide from your description. Just like every new sentence in a paragraph of a novel adds to the detail that you use in your mental image. Like if you've ever listened to two people relaying a shared memory, one of them will mention a detail that the other had forgotten, and that person will go, oh yeah. So when you're sharing an imaginary world with other role players, try to move through it like it was kind of like a shared memory. Somewhere between shared memory and guided meditation, but it's in the now rather than the past, and you're not remembering old details, but perceiving new ones. So if you want to foster an immersive in-character experience, the players are just going to have to be on board with it. How many times am I going to have to say this about role-playing? And the game's going to have to support it, and you're going to have to allow it. You're going to have to let it happen. Keep all talk at the table in universe. Don't have your disembodied player voice travel through the ether to an invisible narrator's ears and say, what does it look like? Because you've got other players at the table who are having an immersive character experience. They hear that. I mean, what are they to think? Now just say, I look at the thing, right? If in doubt, just start every turn with the word I and then interact with the world in some way, or just say what your character is saying. You'd be surprised how much smoother everything goes if we just stick to something like that. When you need to roll, just roll. Just roll and get on with it. Don't play a mini game in the middle of the session. Don't play a board game. Don't suddenly play a dice game. No scouring through pages and pages of books to find a table that's going to help you resolve your simple action. So realistic does not equal verisimilitudinous, right? So pick a game that feels real, not one that you know is mathematically more real. And GMs, don't ever take control of the player characters. Don't ever do something I call verbing, okay? Don't ever say you and then follow it with a verb, like feel. Just say it's cold, okay? Let the player do the verbing. You might tell a player what's happening to them, all right? But don't tell them what their experience is of the thing. Don't tell them what they're doing. If your players just sit around doing nothing then, well, that's on them, okay? That's not being a good player. Good players are proactive. Remember, get them to just, at the start of their turn, say I and then do something. As far as sensory stimulus goes, I think, playing over the internet might actually be the win for this one, because you're probably in the dark. You're probably got your most comfortable clothes on. You're in your comfy chair, and your thermostat is set exactly the way you want it. It's quiet. You've got your headphones on, whatever. I mean, I think that's probably great. I'd be a little bit wary of VTTs that try to be too stimulating, because it's like I said, I think the middle ground is probably detrimental to immersion. You either want to be able to full GANZFELD affected or take over your full field of sensory information, or keep it as minimal and simplistic as possible. In what you provide on your VTT, if you use something like that, basically keep it as minimal as possible. Keep the stimulus as low as possible to leave room for the imaginative experience. On music, I suppose it's probably, if the right music could enhance an immersive experience. I think there is music they use for meditative experiences, so I wouldn't be surprised if there was good and bad music for that kind of thing. So I'll have to think about a bit more about that. I imagine too, it's probably harder to get immersed if you're performing for an audience. You tell me. So I think the in-character immersion of conjured mental imagery is cool. It's used in psychotherapy, so it's probably something that can affect people emotionally, and that may not be something you want. It's probably a pretty intense way to experience the role-playing hobby. Of course, you can role-play without it, but it's a more detached experience. I think it's totally reasonable that players at your table could both be having imaginative inner experiences or doing the PSYCHOBREAK simulation and be perfectly compatible, as long as they're sticking to the conventions of in-character talk. But if you do want to be affected this way, then I would say shed everything from your game that's a meta consideration, stay in character, and limit sensory stimulus. This is the path to opening the doors of perception without drugs. I imagine that people's responses to this video is either going to be like, everyone's going to say, Matt, like, we are immersed all the time. This video doesn't even, not even worth talking about. Either that, or people were going to be like, no, it's impossible. No, you can't get immersed. Or immersion's, it's fake. It's not real. Everything you do in an RPG is immersion breaking. So what's the point? So yeah, let me know the optimal conditions that you have for being immersed in your game, because, well, it might be something that other people want to try out. Until next time, though, my name's Matt. This was the Tomb of Lime. Thanks for listening.